Over the year that this channel has existed, I've been notorious for the way I treat old games. I said that the Elder Scrolls Arena and Daggerfall were bad because they didn't hold up. I respect the games, but I don't like the games. This is because I feel that they didn't have the technology back then to make a game as big as they wanted to. And now, they're just not worth playing. They just don't hold up. However, not only does Halo Combat Evolved hold up, it is still one of the best feeling shooters out there. The movement and gunplay is smooth, the game is responsive, and the mechanics are just fantastic. Not only is the game classic, it is also good. When you talk about the most influential first-person shooters in gaming, stuff like Doom or Wolfenstein often come up. They were probably the first first-person shooters ever. But in my opinion, they were not that influential. Arena actually came out before these games, and even though it didn't have guns, it was still in first person and you had a sword. This would obviously transition into guns eventually. Now, you might be wondering, what does Halo Combat Evolved have that makes it so influential? Think of any popular modern FPS game, stuff like Overwatch, Call of Duty, Battlefield, Counter-Strike, maybe freaking Splitgate. All these games actually follow the formula that Bungie created with Halo Combat Evolved. Sure, Doom being the first to come up with the first-person guns would fit all FPS games formula, but the idea really is just first-person game with guns. That really isn't that hard to come up with. Halo's formula was very complex, and yet most FPS games use the formula. With Doom, you had a weapon bar wheel. What weapons would include guns, fists, to melee, grenades, and more. However, Halo came up with a two-weapon system where melee and grenades were separate inputs. This might not seem like much, but there were only a few select FPS games to not use this system now. Also, what is the most played on platform? Console. What do consoles use? Controllers. Halo's two-weapon system made it viable to play FPS games on console. There are obviously a lot more super influential ideas that Halo 1 came up with, like weapon swapping or revolutionizing vehicles in FPS games, but the two-weapon system, in my opinion, makes Halo the most influential FPS game of all time. Now, Bungie obviously did not have the budget and time to add loads of weapon into the game, so they had to make every single addition count. The result? A really good weapon sandbox. Now, I've talked about this before, but I don't think I've really explained myself yet. A good weapon sandbox is one with no stagnation and just tight and focused where everything has a purpose. Having every piece of the sandbox mean something increases the strategy of what you should carry. Getting the player to think more and get more into it is something that makes games more enjoyable, making the player get caught up in the strategy rather than just repeating the same things. The reason games like Call of Duty don't appeal as much to me as they used to is because they have sandboxes with so much garbage that everything blends together and the strategy just becomes what does the most damage. There's like 100 assault rifles, 40 SMGs, 50 shotguns, 20 you get the idea. This just limits the strategy to just choosing the most overpowered guns or the ones that do the right amount of damage when the difference in game is like 5%. In Halo, the assault rifle is the assault rifle. And that's it. One weapon that fills the role and fits the sandbox. Not 100 weapons jammed into the same category, like Jesus Christ. Halo Combat Evolved might have one of the most simple sandboxes in games, but it is still a damn good one. Now, there is a small bit of controversy when it comes to the balancing of the weapons, specifically regarding the Magnum. In campaign, it fits perfectly, but in multiplayer, it is no secret that the Magnum is really good. It kills a guy in 3 shots if you do it perfectly. In low skill levels, the Magnum is a bit overpowered. It is good at long range, mid range, and close range, being able to outpoint pretty much all the weapons in the sandbox with the right amount of skill. However, at the normal skill levels, the Magnum just kind of feels like a blanket over covering all the sandbox sections, doing good in any situation, but still not being the best in every situation. It definitely should have been less powerful, but I think it takes the right amount of skill to be balanced. Now, believe it or not, Bungie was actually considering not putting multiplayer into Combat Evolved in a few points in development. Obviously, Xbox Live wasn't around back then, so the only way to play multiplayer was on split screen with 3 other people, or to do the much harder option and have a LAN party. The game not having multiplayer would have been massive in the gaming timeline, especially since the next game would also be very influential in this aspect, but that is a story for another time. The game modes in multiplayer were simple and good. Slayer, Oddball, Capture the Flag, King of the Hill, and Race. Of course, there was also game mode variants, but those aren't as big as the actual 5 main game modes. This is all it needs to be. Of course, classic Slayer and Capture the Flag were already staples across multiplayer games, but Bungie still came up with unique ideas like Oddball, a very odd game mode. It had a good selection of game modes and complemented the game's mechanics very well. The maps in this game are really good. Of course, most of them have pretty good geometry and layouts, but where Halo Combat Evolved really shines is in the atmosphere. Every one of these maps has a story to tell and end up making the player feel small and insignificant when they take the time to notice. Blood Gulch boarding action, Damnation, Death Island, and Gyrophobia. All these maps are just so atmospheric and are a treat to take in. Also, the amount of classics in this game is insane too. Of course, the maps I just mentioned, but also Battle Creek, Sidewinder, Timberland, Infinity, Hang'em High. All of these maps are classics. Just an elite map selection, and all of them are unique to play on. Overall, the multiplayer in this game is really good. The weapon sandbox and maps really complement the gameplay mechanics in unique ways. The skill gap is there, and it's glorious. This is probably the Halo multiplayer in its purest form. A situation where everything stands out and I just love it. Mechanically speaking, I think that this multiplayer is top 3 in the series. Just such a fun and unique experience. Probably the most respected part of Halo Combat Evolved is the single player campaign. It is unreal how much praise this gets, and I am very happy for it. I think the reason for this game's praise is that the campaign is a perfect combination of the weapon and enemy sandbox, the level design, the gameplay mechanics, and format. All these elements add up to a quality gameplay loop that continues throughout the entire game. Throughout the game, new mechanics, scenarios, enemies are introduced to keep the player thinking freshly. It is just a quality designed campaign. All the levels in this game are thought out and evolve the gameplay loop in their own way. The game starts with putting the player in tight corridors where they learn the mechanics. Then in the second level, the player gets hit with a huge open area where the player can really take it all in. Halo, the mission, is probably one of the most recognized levels in video games. Everybody talks about the first time they walked out of the drop pod and took in the beauty of the level. And in terms of the level itself, I think it probably could have been better than just rescuing Marines, but people still love it, it's a classic. Truth and Reconciliation is a night level where stealth and the night is introduced. It has you silently go through Covenant forces before getting on the Covenant ship and fighting throughout the enemy corridors. Classic. Silent Cartographer has to be one of the best level layouts where you can traverse through it freely throughout the island and then traverse through a foreigner interior of the ring. Classic. Assault in the Control Room is a little underwhelming. I won't lie, it has a pretty repetitive layout and the Covenants start to feel repetitive too at this point in the campaign. It is also decently long. I would say that it is the weakest level in the game, definitely. 343 Guilty Spark is a classic that introducing the Flood in one of the most iconic video game twists of all time. It is genius how they hint at the Flood throughout the level, and then when you fight the Flood, the gameplay you grew to know gets flipped on its head. The library is actually hated, but I think that fighting the Flood is very fun, and this level is just a lot of that. Classic. Then Two Betrayals has you fight the Sentinels for the first time. You go throughout the same level layout as Assault on the Control Room, except this time, you fight the Flood and the Sentinels, in addition to the Covenant. It keeps the gameplay fresh and introduces more thinking into the gameplay loop. You get to see them fight, and it makes it feel like the good version of Assault on the Control Room. Classic. Keys! You go through a super unique flood-infested caverns with acid pools. The only level to actually look better in the remastered art style. Then, you get on the Covenant ship, except this time it's rotting and you get to fight the Flood too. Classic. And then the best level in the entire game, the Mob. For real, this has to be one of my favorite levels in Halo. It geniusly returns you to the first level, except this time it is rotting away and you get to fight the Sentinels in Flood. The tight corridors in the beginning, the open area in the middle, and the kind of rough, yet iconic last section where you drive your Warthog and escape the Pillar of Autumn. Classic! Overall, this is a very well designed campaign. Every weapon has a purpose and every enemy has an exploitable weakness. Grunts and Jackals, while they do come in numbers, they are light infantry that can be easily taken out with a headshot. Elites have shields, so you have to use plasma weapons to strip their shields and then you can take them out. Flood are very vulnerable to massive amounts of projectiles, so shotguns and assault rifles can take them out. Hunters are very famous for having a weak spot on their back, and Sentinels can be fried with plasma weapons. This makes the player think a lot since you can only carry 2 weapons. I will say, however, that it doesn't have as much depth in terms of level design as Halo Reach or Halo 3. Halo 1 is very expansive, but it doesn't have that much depth. Still, it is a very good campaign though, and definitely one of the best of all time. It deserves the praise it gets.
What do we have, Sergeant?
Looks like a Covenant patrol. Badass elite units. All KIA.
Real pretty. Friend of yours?
No, we just met.
The story starts off with the Pillar of Autumn fleeing away from the Covenant towards the Sacred Halo. The Covenant view it as sacred and religious. Captain Keyes is the captain of the Pillar of Autumn. He obviously gives orders, but also has a sense of humor. Cortana is actually a copy of an early version of Halsey's mind, but now with unlimited knowledge, so she is very quick-witted and sometimes makes snarky comments. Master Chief is there to do the only thing he knows: shoot and do whatever he can to help humanity. He lived his whole life under the UNSC, so it is all he knows. Sergeant Johnson is the sergeant of the ship. He is very confident and gives a sense of humanity to the soldiers around him. The main characters are very similar to how the Halo Wars 1 characters were designed, but these ones actually have depth and personality. Anyway, as the Pillar of Autumn is fleeing and flying away, the Covenant is able to attack it and send the troops to crash land and scatter throughout the Halo ring. Once Master Chief recovers, him and Cortana focus on recovering survivors and establishing a defense on the Halo ring. After a while, Master Chief and Cortana get informed that the Pillar of Autumn was raided by the Covenant and Captain Keyes was captured. They go out on a mission and rescue Captain Keyes. The UNSC forces regroup and learn of the control room that has access to Halo's weapon systems. The UNSC decides that the Covenant gaining control of Halo's weapons would be way too dangerous. They decide to go out and get control of the room before the Covenant can. The UNSC gets to the Silent Cartographer Island and fights throughout the island. Eventually, Master Chief gains control of the control room and inserts Cortana into the systems. Cortana, while in the systems, learns that the Covenant uncovered an ancient evil, and Captain Keyes and other UNSC forces are headed straight to it. Cortana tells Master Chief to go and stop them before they run into something deadly. Master Chief goes to the location to learn that he was too late, and the Flood are already on the loose. Seeing how both the Covenant and UNSC forces are being infected, he identifies them as the main and most dangerous threat. That is why when 343 Guilty Spark, the monitor of the Halo Ring, shows up and offers help to stop the Flood, Master Chief agrees almost immediately. 343 Guilty Spark teleports Master Chief to the library where Master Chief can obtain the key to fire Halo. Guilty Spark tells Master Chief that the way to stop the Flood is to fire the Halo Ring. Master Chief and 343 Guilty Spark return to the control room to activate Halo, but Cortana is the first to stop them. She says that the only way to stop the Flood is to starve them, and firing the Halo Ring would just kill everybody, the Flood's food. Master Chief and Cortana obviously take it back and don't go through with it. 343 Guilty Spark gets mad and turns against Chief and Cortana. Chief and Cortana escape the control room and EMP the power systems so Halo can't be activated. Cortana then learns that Keyes is still alive in a Covenant ship and she and Chief go to help him. However, when they get to him, they learn that he has been transformed into a Flood hive mind. Chief rips out his brain and retreats with Cortana. Cortana then figures out a plan to blow up the Pillar of Autumn, and that should be enough to destroy the Halo Ring. Chief and Cortana go to the Pillar of Autumn, now in ruins, to find Guilty Spark already there, preventing them from detonating the ship. After fighting for a long time, Chief and Cortana eventually blow up the Pillar of Autumn and escape the Halo Ring. Halo 1 will always be known as a classic, a simple yet effective game that set the formula for other first-person shooters to come. The story ends with the potential for more games to come, an ending to a true masterpiece of a video game. I give Halo Combat Evolved an 8 out of 10. Truly, the most influential shooter of all time.
Shut them down. We'll need them later. Fancy a look?
Did anyone else make it?
Scanning. Just dust and echoes. We're all that's left. We did what we had to do for Earth. An entire Covenant armada obliterated, and the Flood. We had no choice. Halo, it's finished.
No. I think we're just getting started.